with the City of Seattle. And that office and Valerie has the challenging task of trying to bring all these departments within the city together to look at more of a unified strategy for adaptation across the city.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you also to Amy and Paul, and to you guys for coming. I've got a wicked cold, so bear with me. I'm a climate protection planning specialist at the City of Seattle in the Office of Sustainability and Environment. And I think based on what I read on the agenda, I'm supposed to be speaking about lessons learned from adaptation at the local level. But we're so early in our process where we're rolling up all of the adaptation work that the utilities are doing and bringing other departments to the table, that it would be more accurate to say lessons not yet learned or lessons people are telling us we're going to learn. But I'll dive into some social science research that we commissioned, and I'll give you a high-level view of what we're planning on doing, and then maybe next year I'll come back and tell you what we actually learned. The City of Seattle, like most cities, is responsible for things like land use regulation and planning, transportation, infrastructure and services, parks, recreation, human services, solid waste, and a slew of other things. Unlike most cities, though, Seattle owns its water supply resources and electricity system. And you've heard from Paul and Amy at SPU and Crystal at City Light about what adaptation looks like from these utilities, but I want to highlight that owning these things, all of these utilities is the exception and not really the rule. The levels of expertise in understanding climate impacts and knowing how to use climate projections in planning varies dramatically across the city. SPU and City Light, as rate-funded utilities where their resources are very climate dependent, as you can tell, have a high level of expertise in-house and have been at the leading edge of this work for a long time. Other departments have just begun considering projected climate impacts in their work, and so among many other things, my office, the Office of Sustainability and Environment, is responsible for planning for both mitigation and adaptation across all departments, and we daylight the work of the utilities and use a lot of their same planning models, and we coordinate a lot of the other players. So the Seattle City Council adopted Seattle's Climate Action Plan in June of last year, and it's largely mitigation focused, but it sets as a goal to be carbon neutral by 2050. It also has one chapter, short chapter, on adaptation, which essentially says you need an adaptation plan. And so that's where we are right now. We're beginning this as we speak, and we're expected to have a completed plan by June of next year. And again, we're leveraging a lot of the work and planning methods at SPU and City Light. Our two main priorities at this point are, first of all, enhancing the quality of our neighborhoods. So if we emerge from this process and have the same city, but with just more resilient neighborhoods, we'll have failed. We're looking, at this as at resilience as a multifaceted concept. And as we adapt to climate impacts, we're hoping to build really vibrant, connected communities, neighborhoods where people really want to live and work and play. We're also prioritizing actions that help vulnerable populations who are usually least able to respond to climate change and have the fewest resources. And these are historically underrepresented communities like communities of color, recent immigrants, low-income communities. And we recognize that fostering resilience in these communities and supporting their recovery is critical. So as part of scoping our community outreach and engagement strategy for our adaptation planning, we commissioned Harstad Research to do some social science research on Seattle-specific values and climate messaging that inspire people to support climate actions. You may recognize Harstad as they've done extensive national research, but very little has been done around Seattle-specific values. And so we wanted to see if what was true at the national level held true for Seattleites or if there was a marked difference. We were looking at community values, how these values are linked to beliefs about climate change and climate action, how values can build support for climate action, and the importance Seattleites place on being a climate action leader. Harstad interviewed 603 registered voters in the city of Seattle by telephone from June 2nd through June 5th. And as an aside, I worked very briefly at the Gallup organization in college, doing exactly this as a telephone interviewer. I lasted about 15 minutes because it's so hard. This is not a short survey. I don't know how they got that many people willing to sit down and talk about this, but they did. Miracle of miracles. So what they found was that most Seattleites believe climate change is real and recognize the responsibility we all share in addressing it. The proportion of climate deniers in Seattle is very small, fewer than 1 in 8. And Seattleites tend to reject the argument that nothing can be done about climate change. That said, they're unsure of exactly what needs to be done. When asked for the top 2 or 3 most important issues or problems facing Seattle, 45% of respondents said transportation infrastructure. This includes things like traffic congestion, needing more public transit. 40% cited social problems, education, drugs, poverty, homelessness. 30% cited the economy or cost of living, jobs, unemployment, wages, housing affordability. 20% cited city government, like poor city services, or something more specific like the police. And 10%, only 10% gave an answer that would fall into this place-based category, environmental justice concerns, climate change. And in fact, only 5% answered climate change or global warming outright. It may be that climate change isn't thought of as a local issue, or people don't know if city government has a lot of ability to influence climate change issues, and that in and of itself is an interesting finding. But because research shows that climate action or support for climate action increases when you connect it to these other top-of-mind issues, any opportunity to paint transportation investment, for example, as having clear climate benefits gives you a bigger bang for your buck for both the transportation and the climate. Most people agree that something needs to be done. Seattleites are generally motivated by obligations to the common good. They want to slow climate change because it's the right thing to do, or because they see their city as a place where people make efforts to care for one another. Nearly everyone, this is a staggering number, nearly everyone, 97% of respondents say it's either very important or extremely important that Seattle does its part to address climate change. Support drops significantly, but it's still a high number, to 68% when you frame the question as how important is it that Seattle is a leader in addressing climate change. So again, this concept of our shared obligation, we're in it together, everybody does their part, is more important than Seattle being a leader. People aren't generally aware of the effects of climate change or the anticipated effects on their community. It isn't as urgent or as important as other social problems, and it tends to be seen as somewhat removed from their lives. Specifically, they don't know that Seattle will see more frequent and intense rainfall, storm surge, sea level rise, extreme heat. And when they become aware of these risks, their support for climate action grows. So making the case for climate action in Seattle. What do? We want to build the case for climate action on believable facts. The key building block is the knowledge that climate change is already having devastating effects across the globe. That's something that most Seattleites have heard and they find believable. And so you build on this widely acknowledged but sort of far off broad risk, and then connect it to their lives, articulating how climate change will affect Seattle. Because once informed of these risks, again, they're more supportive of their city taking action, particularly adaptation action. Focusing on near-term risks creates the broadest mandate for climate action. Reinforcing co-benefits that actions aimed at mitigating and adapting to climate change also improve quality of life, makes people more supportive of climate action. And then developing an inside-outside communication strategy appears key. So City Light, police, firefighters, and OSC are seen as credible messengers within the city government. University scientists and environmental groups are among the most credible sources outside of the government. And the messages that these messengers are asked to deliver seems to matter too. University scientists and environmental groups are effective at informing voters of flooding risks and threats to the natural environment. Things like the changing climate is already devastating the planet, and higher temperatures and changes in precipitation will threaten our region's natural environment. Well-placed city messengers, on the other hand, are credible sources on issues like the growth of the city, traffic congestion, and safety concerns. Things like the Seattle metro area is expected to grow by over 1 million people in the next 30 years, or the combination of higher temperatures and more traffic congestion will worsen air quality. So I think the most interesting research, or the most interesting findings, were when we tested different messages about what inspired people to support climate action. And these are in order of persuasiveness, percentage of respondents who ranked each message 8 or above on a 0 to 10 scale. And the most persuasive messages were a responsibility to our children, the narrative that we're responsible to address climate change, not just for ourselves, but for our children. We want our children to have the same, if not higher, quality of life than we do. And 88% of people found this narrative to be very compelling. The next was the idea that Seattleites have a reputation for being good stewards of the earth. So Seattle is set in the most beautiful location in the world, surrounded by water and forests and mountains, and we have to preserve this. Economic prosperity was also a good one. Seattle is a prosperous city with a strong economy, low unemployment, good wages, diverse businesses. Addressing climate change will help ensure Seattle has economic opportunities for decades to come. And I won't go through all of them, but the least persuasive, interestingly, equity ranked very low. Rising sea levels, increasing temperatures, flooding will impact people and families who can't afford to move from a flood zone or prepare their homes or property or find another job are most vulnerable. It's not fair, that sort of narrative. That was only persuasive for 59% of people. The narrative about a petroleum drain, about our reliance on oil and gas result in carbon pollution, and they make a lot of money and boo them. And then only half of people, or less than half of people, again, found it interesting or compelling that Seattle is known around the world as a leader in addressing climate change. We're one of the first cities to act, and we've gone further than nearly every other city. Other cities look to us for an example. And I guess that was surprising to me because within the city government, I feel like everybody's talking about, oh, we're a leader, but the people out there don't really care. So I guess that's all I have. I have a couple minutes for questions. I think the most dramatic difference was this appeal to the common good. Like Seattleites are really motivated to see themselves as almost socialist and doing good for the masses because that's who we are and we have to help everybody else. But it was also in direct, directly different when we tested that message overtly. The equity message ranked really poorly. So I think it's a more subtle idea about who we are, and that was the biggest difference between the national research and the Seattle specific.
I actually come from the public health and equity side of things, and I have 2 questions related to that. One, I'm sure the survey was designed to be random sampling, but not everybody's going to be willing to speak and answer the phone. So my first question is, did the sample end up being representative, particularly with the kind of groups that you were talking about that are historically not represented? And then my second question is,
I am also from public health. That's my background, so good questions. Oh, sorry, the first question is, we made efforts for it to be, she is assuming that we made efforts for it to be a representative sample, and we did, but we did not necessarily reach people with limited English proficiency and recent immigrants and that sort of thing. And so we totally acknowledge that, and we have a plan for doing focus groups with those groups, and we have a very good POEL program at Seattle where trusted advocates within the community go into community settings like churches and barbershops and wherever people are comfortable talking about this sort of thing, and ask these questions so that we can have a really good mix, because these are people who we're trying to accommodate, and acknowledging vulnerable populations and making resilient communities for vulnerable populations is one of our priorities. So.
Great. Thank you very much, Valerie.
Thank
so
you.
I think